summarize here?
Yes, sir. Right here. Yes, sir.
We thank you very much indeed, Your Excellency, for those splendid remarks of yours, and even if we had not known of your splendid record of service to your government, we could agree easily with Mr. Barker that Turkey is indeed fortunate to have you in your current position. And we on our part feel most grateful and proud that your great country and ours are allies. Now, gentlemen, I should like to present Mr. Thomas H. Coulter, Chief Executive Officer of the Chicago Association of Commerce and Industry, who will summarize the conference. Mr. Coulter.
Thank you, Admiral Forstall. Before getting into my summary remarks and recommendations, I have a special announcement to make concerning the 1959-60 program for the Institute for American Strategy. The overall conclusion is clear. The Soviet threat on all fronts cannot be overstated. The immediate task is to get that specific message to the American people. How is the job to be done, and who will do it? Well, as of midnight last night, we have started. 2 of Chicago's leading citizens have pledged to implement the program. Mr. Edwin A. Locke, president of the Union Tank Car Company, has accepted the chairmanship of the Executive Committee of the Institute for American Strategy. Brigadier General Lawrence H. Whiting, president of the American Furniture Mart, has accepted the associate chairmanship. And scores of prominent participants in the 5th Annual Military Industrial Conference have already volunteered to serve under their leadership. This is a national conference, and the Institute for American Strategy is a national organization. Rest assured, however, that with help from the rest of the nation, Chicago will shoulder its headquarters responsibility. Chicago, with this great new window on the world, has a vital role to play in strengthening both national and free world security. Within 90 days, the Executive Committee of the Institute for American Strategy will be in touch with all participants as to specific programs. Meanwhile, each participant, as his first task on his return home, is earnestly requested to write to Mr. Dan Sullivan, our Executive Director, giving him ideas and suggestions. Specifically, the Institute wants names of people and organizations who want to give high priority to the study of strategy. As a major project is already underway. A private foundation has just pledged $50,000 to help us spread the study of strategy all over the United States. In other words, the first project of the Institute has been approved, fully staffed, and financed. A unique 2-week training course covering all aspects of strategy in the nuclear age will be given to 200 reserve officers at the National War College in Washington on July 12th through 25th. These men, in turn, will lecture on strategy to their own civic clubs and business groups, to high schools, colleges, and professional societies. The 2-week seminar will be co-sponsored by the Institute for American Strategy and the Reserve Officers Association. The Department of Defense has approved this training course for members of the reserve components, specifically selected from all segments of commerce, industry, and opinion-forming groups as a means of increasing public understanding and the nature and scope of the threat to national security. The curriculum, designed to cover all aspects of strategy in the nuclear age, will encompass many of the topics discussed over the past 5 years at the National Military Industrial Conference. The seminar will be conducted chiefly by civilian scholars, many of whom have lectured to the Chicago Military Industrial Conference. Military leaders, diplomats, and key members of Congress will also participate. The civilian professors preparing the course have the assistance of a consulting and advisory committee of general and flag officers representing all the services in cooperation with the Commandant of the National War College. Dr. Robert Strauss Huppé of the University of Pennsylvania will be Dean of the Faculty at the summer session. He is the Director of the Foreign Policy Research Institute and a member of the Educational Projects Committee of the Institute for American Strategy. The Reserve Officers Association will also co-sponsor the seminars. Course material will also include the impact of missiles on geopolitics, an analysis of communist conflict management, the role of economic aid, technical assistance, and propaganda in the present international situation, case studies in the Kremlin's non-military techniques, an overall assessment of Sino-Soviet military, industrial, and scientific capabilities, and the study of comparative ideologies. This experiment explores a new dimension in partnership for the defense between government, the military services, reserve officers, and civilian educators. It illustrates their growing awareness that strategy is everybody's business, a constant theme of the National Military Industrial Conference. The Chicago Institute for American Strategy will help prepare lecture kits which will be distributed to all officers taking the National War College course as an aid to them in preparing their own lectures to local groups. This will include papers on such matters as psychological warfare, the problem of lead time in basic research, war gaming, the role of commerce and industry in foreign aid, and citizenship awareness as a factor in national wealth. The whole project was made possible by the informal and voluntary cooperation of private citizens, military personnel, and educators who met each other for the first time through the activities of the National Military Industrial Conference in Chicago. We are on our way, and that is indeed very good news. Now, I'd like to present some observations and conclusions about the economic, psychological, and propaganda aspects of Soviet expansionism as has been developed here over the past 3 days, and more particularly in some very late sessions with the distinguished members of the panel, which I had the honor to be chairman. The newness of the Soviet economic challenge and the lack of understanding of its psychological and propaganda aspects on the part of the American public and business has made this conference an intriguing experience as experts in the fields of foreign trade, education, research, science, business, government, and the military services have revealed their observations, analyses, and opinions of how the latest communist threats in the Cold War can be successfully challenged and defeated. The conference is indebted to those principal speakers whose profound views provoked such interest from the record audience and contributed so much to the substantive questions presented to the panel sessions and the conference and the keen observations of the respondents. The principal objectives of the panel on the economic, psychological, and propaganda aspects of Soviet expansionism were as follows. First, define the nature and threat of the Soviet economic challenge. Second, evaluate the scope of the new communist offensive. 3, describe its operations in actual practice. 4, suggest how it can be successfully combated. And 5, recommend policies for private business and government to meet its threat immediately and decisively. The Soviet economic threat has taken form in the past 2 years as America's firm stand against Russian armed threats and aggression has created a nuclear stalemate for the time being. The new communist propaganda line had its beginnings in November 1956 when Mr. Khrushchev boasted, "Whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will bury you." Later he announced, "We declare war on you in the peaceful field of trade. We declare a war we will win over the United States. The threat to the United States is not the ICBM, but in the field of peaceful production. We are relentless in this, and we will prove the superiority of our system." In 1957, he declared, "We think capitalism should be destroyed not by means of war and military conflict, but through an ideological and economic struggle." In January of this year, at the 21st Communist Party Congress, he boasted about Soviet economic achievements and promised that in 15 years, the USSR would take first place in the world not only in total output, but also in per capita production. Going back further to the eve of the October Revolution in 1917, Lenin stated, "War is inexorable. It poses the question with ruthless sharpness, to perish or catch up with the leading countries and outstrip them economically." From Stalin on Revolution in 1948, quote, "The goal is to consolidate the dictatorship of the proletariat in one country, using it as a base for the overthrow of imperialism in all countries." This relentless enmity on the part of Soviet Russia for the Western democracies has remained steadfast for 42 years. It is now clear that the Russians feel strong enough to engage in open economic conflict and secure enough from military attack that they are now in position to outstrip, overthrow, and eventually control the world. The stark fact is that we are engaged in an all-out economic war, and the Sino-Soviet bloc has given itself 15 years to make good its boast in this death struggle for world supremacy. While the While the Russians hope to gain their ends by methods short of military war, they have repeatedly shown their willingness to use military threats and adventures to achieve these ends. Witness Berlin, Poland, Formosa Straits, Korea, Greece, Hungary, Indochina, and Tibet. Even though they may honestly hope to avoid war, their economic policies nurture the seeds of war because Mr. Khrushchev has stated, "We value trade least for economic reasons and most for political purposes." The first manifestations of the Soviet economic war are now a matter of record, as well as the political and propaganda aspects of the new offensive. During the 13th United Nations General Assembly sessions, Bolivia, Indonesia, Malaya, and Thailand complained against the Soviet Union, which incidentally is a tin purchaser and not a tin producer, about dumping tin in the world market. The Bolivian delegates said the USSR was guilty of economic aggression designed to bring about the collapse of the international tin market. Bolivia was hardest hit when tin prices dropped 12%. At the same time that Moscow was striking at the Bolivian economy and inflicting misery on its working people, the Soviet fifth column in Bolivia, the communists, were violently denouncing the United States and the Bolivian government for the unemployment caused by their masters in Moscow. This is a typical example of the tactics of international communist gangsters working both sides of the street. Soviet dumping, whether it be tin, aluminum, rice, or cotton, is not due to surpluses at home in Russia. If the Soviet people were not being deprived of consumer goods, Russia today would be short of tin, aluminum, and cotton, all of which have recently been dumped. In fact, the Soviet government often resells at lower prices in the very country from which it had previously purchased its commodities. And Egyptian cotton is a good case in point. Soviet trade missions are busy in the underdeveloped nations of Asia, Africa, Latin, and Europe. They are meeting with success. Free world trade in the Soviet bloc increased from $3.5 billion in 1951 to $6 billion in 1957. Czechoslovakia is building a sugar refinery in Ceylon and a tire factory in Indonesia. Romania is selling oil drilling equipment in India and supplying the inevitable teams of technical observers. Even Red China, with massive economic problems at home, is extending aid and establishing textile mills in Burma. Russia is building a large steel mill in India, where its trade has grown from 22 million in 1953 to 122 million in 1956. Moscow has made so much noise about attaching no strings to any credits or economic aid it may give. The experience of Yugoslavia exposes the fraud of this Kremlin claim. It was not economic competition, but political differences between two communist regimes which led Khrushchev to withdraw the credits from Tito. In reality, the Soviet Union attaches no strings, but ropes to its economic aid. Nasser can say much to enlighten the world on this score, as can the Burmese government about the operations of the Bank of China in Burma financing the communist conspiracy and its military operations against this courageous Asian people. It is not concerned for the needs of the people, but only interested in advancing communist imperialism, which explains Pepin's recent gift of 6 factories to Yemen, although this extremely underdeveloped country has no labor force to operate the plants. The most serious impact of the Soviet industrial power is on the newly independent countries of Africa and Asia. These countries are in a great hurry to industrialize. Because of the vast industrial advances made by the USSR in the last 40 years, some leaders in these new nations look on communist Russia as a model for a shortcut to rapid industrialization and prosperity. These leaders fail to see that the communist shortcut can only short-circuit their newly won independence and destroy the democratic liberties they won after many years of bitter struggle. The Soviet bloc has been skilled in its demagogy, timing, and tactics, all calculated to give the impression of communist interest in the well-being of the people. Soviet economic penetration in these young nations will bring rewards to the USSR far in excess of the volume of Soviet credit loans or their trade or aid. Should Russia ever equal or exceed the United States industrial capacity, this phase of the Soviet threat would become even more serious. Since 1939, Soviet Russia has brought 15 once independent nations into a state of abject servitude. It has a hard core of agents in practically every country of the world. The current economic offensive of the Sino-Soviet bloc in the remaining underdeveloped countries of the free world began in 1954, and the first sizable credit agreements were concluded in 1955. By the end of 1958, the bloc had signed agreements with 18 less developed countries to provide $2.4 billion in credits and grants for economic and military aid. The USSR has been in the forefront of the offensive with $1.6 billion, the European satellites next with $650 million, and Communist China about $120 million. At the end of 1958, a little over $900 million had actually been delivered, but most of it was in military aid. The increasing tempo of the bloc offensive is indicated by the fact that aid agreements covering approximately $1 billion were concluded in 1958, as compared to only $300 million the previous year. Some of the larger bloc commitments in 1958 included for Egypt, $175 million for various development projects and $100 million for the Aswan Dam, and there were also large additional arms credits. In Argentina, they got $100 million for the petroleum industry. In Indonesia, $225 million for military and economic aid. Iraq, $120 million for arms. Ceylon, $30 million for development projects and $10 million for machinery. India, $21 million for a foundry and $11 million for a refinery. In Yemen, $41 million largely for transportation projects. In addition to aid to the free world countries, intra-bloc aid in the form of credits, grants, and property transfers were on the order in 1958 of $6 to $7 billion. In the 10-year period, 1948 to 58, the United States, through 5 main sources, namely the International Cooperation Administration, the Department of Defense through the Mutual Security Program, the Development Loan Fund, Public Law 480, and the Export-Import Bank, provided about $25 billion in military and economic assistance to some 55 less developed countries of the free world. Of this total, about $16 billion was economic assistance. Since 1955, when the Soviet bloc became active in economic aid programs, the United States has extended about $4.4 billion in both military and economic aid to the 18 free world less developed countries which have accepted bloc assistance, as compared to $2.4 billion for the bloc during roughly the same period. Of these amounts, economic aid from the United States was $3.3 billion compared to about $1.6 billion for the communist bloc. The terms under which the bloc and U.S. aid are provided differ quite markedly. Practically all the bloc aid has been in the form of credit, while U.S. aid has been largely in grants and loans. The Soviet credits carry interest rates of 2 to 2.5%, the satellite countries 3 to 4%, and the United States 3.5 to 6%. The United States allows longer time for repayment, up to about 40 years, compared to 12 years or less for the Soviets. Most bloc agreements provide for at least partial repayment in commodities, while a substantial portion of U.S. loans have required payment in dollars, although currently an increasing number are repaying in local currencies. Bloc assistance is virtually all tied to the use of bloc goods and services, while much U.S. assistance is used by the recipient actually for procurement in other countries. During the first half of 1958, Soviet exports to the less developed countries continued to rise at a significant rate, about 15%. During the latter half of 1958, about 2,800 non-military technicians from the Sino-Soviet bloc spent a month or more in the 19 free world countries the Soviets are aiding. Corresponding military personnel numbered about 1,200. A minimum of at least 1,000 students have accepted scholarship offers in the Soviet bloc, and compared with their 50 bilateral trade agreements at the end of 1953, bloc countries had 177 trade agreements in force, with 32 countries at the end of 1958. It's easy to exaggerate the importance of certain Sino-Soviet activities because one would expect the second largest nation in the world to engage in international trade on a considerable scale, and Russian trade with the rest of the world has lagged far behind that of a normal nation. As long as trade with Russia does not constitute a sufficiently large component of the trade of another country to give the Soviets actual or potential control or undue pressure over the country, as is the case for Finland, for example, its results are not all bad, and in some cases can be beneficial to the country and the free world. Insofar as Soviet development projects assist the country concerned without creating possibilities for control, undue pressure or propaganda effects, the result may be to reduce the need of the country for development assistance from us and other countries. And I wish they'd compete with us more on that. Taken as a whole, however, and particularly in conjunction with the prospect of an increase in the Russian gross national product over the next few years of about 6% per annum as contrasted with a U.S. rate of 4%, the Sino-Soviet economic threat places the United States in a position of great peril. Right now, the whole grant and loan development assistance program to the less developed countries is being questioned in light of the almost insurmountable task of having economic development keep up with population gains in these countries. It has been noted that a 2% annual increase in per capita gross national product, which is considered a good performance in a less developed country, would in the case of a $60 a year per capita income in India, for example, provide each person with only a little over $1 addition to his yearly income. Reference is frequently made to the fact that America just does not have the resources to assist in increasing substantially the living standards of the millions in the less developed countries of the world. We give economic developmental aid as an incentive for countries to seek the realization of their national aspirations within the economic and political framework of the free world. The masses of the people of these countries are dedicated to a betterment of their way of life. They do not expect miracles, but must see activity and at least hope of some progress. We need these nations in the free world, both from the standpoint of their trade, raw materials, political support in and out of the United Nations, and their moral and psychological support in the Cold War. In the present uneasy balance between the Sino-Soviet dominated and free world groupings, the loss of any nation is a major disaster. The whole world watches in fascinated horror today as Iraq appears to be slipping into the quicksand of Soviet domination. What is happening in Iraq can happen elsewhere. The Draper Committee, in its recent interim report, posed the problem of foreign aid as being, in its broadest aspect, a basic issue of foreign policy and our most potent weapon in meeting the Soviet economic challenge. With our government leadership committed to a long-range continuing economic aid program, the where, when, and how much to use with our government leadership committed to a long-range continuing economic aid program, the where, when, and how much to use it represents the most important decisions in the strategy of the Cold War. It has been suggested that its present amount of about 1% of our gross national product could be continued indefinitely without serious consequences to the American economy. As we view the threat of the new Soviet offensive in the so-called field of peaceful trade, and plan our strategy to combat it immediately and decisively, it is enlightening to evaluate our relative strength in the vital areas of industrial capacity, research, manpower, and productivity. In all basic resources, such as the steel industry, power production, and transportation, the United States holds an impressive advantage of at least 2 to 1, but the Soviets are making impressive gains and are closing the gap. With the additional capacity of the committed nations of the free world, our advantage over the Sino-Soviet bloc is even more impressive. For example, the West produces 3 times as much steel, 4 times as much petroleum, and almost twice as much coal. Comparing the United States and Russia directly, we exceed Russia by a substantial margin in the production of almost every item necessary to make capital goods or consumer goods. With only 6% of the world's production, with only 6% of the world's population, the United States is today consuming almost 60% of the world's production, of which about 1/2, of course, is produced in the United States. For decades, the United States has been the shining model of economic growth in the eyes of the world. Our way of life, and especially our prosperity and security, have been the most eloquent arguments ever advanced in favor of democracy as a political form and of free enterprise as an economic system. Now Russia wants to be that model so that the peoples and nations of the world will in the same way be attracted to communism. They are convinced that if they can overtake us, then all the great uncommitted areas of the world in Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe and Latin America will swing to their side. The propaganda aspects of Soviet research in the missile and nuclear fields have been impressive because in rocketry they are ahead, probably 5 years ahead in certain aspects. The Russians are training more engineers and scientists than are we, and have an impressive lead right now in numbers, but not yet in quality. They have made They have noticeable major weaknesses in the chemical industry, hence their latest efforts to buy chemical plants in the United States on a turnkey basis to telescope the years of research and development American companies have invested in this industry. The Soviets will have to spend tens of thousands of man-years of scientific and technical effort to perfect our developments if we do not sell them our know-how. In the 5 specific types of technology, it took American industry, in 5 specific types of technology, particularly in the plastics field, it took American industry about 10,000 man-years to bring the developments through the laboratory and into production. To reach Russian goals in these same products within their new 7-year plan would require the full time of more than 1,400 of Russia's best chemists and chemical engineers. And since Khrushchev has told his people research and training in these areas has been sadly neglected, probably not even this many could reach their goals without Western aid. As research and development expenditures in America continue to skyrocket to almost $60 billion in this decade, and with a prediction of twice that amount in the 1960s, that's $120 billion between 1960 and 70, it would seem that our future vitality and lead over the Soviets is assured with one exception. That exception is the continuing spiral of inflation in the USA, which threatens profits, curtails expansion, reduces productivity, creates unemployment, and is currently pricing many American-made products out of the market both at home and abroad. Unless inflation is curbed and productivity greatly increased, the American dream of continued economic growth, prosperity, and security may be forfeited to the Soviets. This is currently our greatest threat and challenge here at home. There are 3 main reasons for the current inflation. The first is government deficit spending, second, government subsidies and artificial price supports in agriculture, and third, continuing wage demands and pay increases in excess of productivity gains. You'll notice that the classical reason for inflation is not included in the list, namely, demand for goods and services in excess of supply. Because of the current interest in the outcome of the steel industry wage negotiations this summer, it is worthy to note what has been happening to labor costs and productivity in this basic industry in recent years. During the past decade, steel employment costs have risen 8% per annum, while steel productivity has risen only 2.5% per annum. Overall, since 1948, direct wages have gone up more than 50%. During the same period, productivity has increased only 30%. This is the inflationary gap that contributes to our wage price spiral and causes prices to rise even in periods of recession. Manufacturers trying to hold down prices are caught in a profit squeeze. In 1947, corporate profits after taxes were 9.2%. In 1957, they were down to 6%. Another alarming trend is now evident. Small businesses are becoming less profitable than big ones. In recent years, small and middle-sized companies have suffered decreases in profits ranging from 15 to 38%, while big companies had only an 11% drop in profits. This premium on size of business is a major retardant to the development and growth of new small businesses so essential to an American dynamic economy. High taxes, low depreciation rates, and accelerating obsolescence compound the problems of American industry in meeting the Soviet economic challenge. Between 1947 and 1957, the value of plant, property, and equipment per worker increased from a little over $2,500 to $6,600, almost a 3-fold increase in 11 years. In Chicago today, the investment per worker in new industrial plants averages about $13,000. Since tax laws require depreciation on the basis of original cost, not replacement value, adequate reserves cannot be accumulated to take care of normal depreciation, much less obsolescence. Soviet industry has no such problems. Unless productivity catches up with and goes ahead of wage increases, the American dream of a progressive standard of living will become a nightmare of inflation and insolvency with inevitable controls on prices, rents, and wages. Such controls in peacetime will mean the death of unions, the end of free enterprise, and encroachment on our personal liberties. This is not only a challenge to industry, but a threat to the security of every American citizen. The voice of business must compete more effectively with the voice of labor at the grassroots of public opinion and political action if we are to meet the Soviet economic threat, survive as a free nation, and continue to provide leadership in a free world. Before planning any grand strategy to meet the Soviet threat around the world, it seems worthy to note the internal threats to our security right here at home. Maybe our foreign friends and competitors who have experienced inflation, lost their freedoms, and are now austerely coming back, like Germany, Britain, and Japan, can teach us some lessons if we will only listen. Before summarizing the stratagems presented at this conference, which can help us develop an American strategy to defeat the Soviet economic offensive, these facts should be kept constantly in mind. First, communist bloc trade or aid does not involve the profit motive or good business in the American sense. When it can, the bloc strikes hard bargains, but the Politburo is willing where necessary to view financial loss for political gain. American private business cannot meet such a challenge indefinitely by applying normal business profit judgment. All Soviet trading is conducted through government trading agencies and not by individuals nor companies. Second, the Soviet Politburo aims every action on the economic front at political objectives. Through propaganda and psychological tactics, the Soviets intend to destroy free governments now in power. With these facts in mind, it is obvious that American businessmen and our friends and allies in the free world are at a distinct, if not impossible, disadvantage in conducting foreign trade along normal traditional lines. Several suggestions were made to combat Soviet dumping and below-market pricing practices, and here are some of them. One is to create an American government corporation to compete with the Soviet government trading agencies on equal terms. Next, to establish a program of government subsidies for American companies operating abroad to meet Soviet price competition similar to our agricultural subsidies. Another is to encourage American investment in foreign operations to obtain the advantages of a local industry. Next, to reduce corporation taxes, particularly on American businesses with foreign operations, to make them more competitive in world markets. Then, make greater use of foreign currencies received by our government agencies from the sale of surplus commodities. Next, to establish a program of government subsidies for American companies operating abroad to meet Soviet price competition similar to our agricultural subsidies. Another is to encourage American investment in foreign operations to obtain the advantages of a local industry. Next, to reduce corporation taxes, particularly on American businesses with foreign operations, to make them more competitive in world markets. Then, make greater use of foreign currencies received by our government agencies from the sale of surplus commodities. For example, wheat sold under Public Law 480 by U.S. investors requiring such currencies for the support of their foreign operations. The U.S. could only gain from such a policy, and no foreign country would ever be harmed by it. Another is to encourage restraint on the part of business and labor against ever-increasing wages and prices, and insist that wage increases be more than offset by productivity increases. Stimulate more receptive import policies for three reasons. One, we cannot expect foreign countries to resist Sino-Soviet overtures while we deny them access to our markets. Next, we cannot continue indefinitely to sell more to foreign countries than we buy from them. And third, competition from foreign imports here at home will stimulate competition and help keep prices and living costs lower. This in turn may soften labor union demands and curtail automatic wage increases based on a cost of living index. National goals like the 7-year plan should be encouraged for private industry to assure a continued high rate of industrial growth. Another suggestion is to establish a firm, coordinated foreign economic policy aimed at the expansion of our trade and investments abroad. Another, to provide tax incentive for private enterprise to assume the special risks involved in foreign business operations. Next, to not overlook and fully explore Russian overtures to trade with us in non-strategic products with the hope of relieving East-West tensions. Then continue the United States economic aid program while encouraging private business to supplant it with private investment wherever possible. Then to establish a national policy concerning trade with Russia to encourage the following. First, within the limits of security and the demands of the economy of ourselves and our allies, continue trade with Russians and finished goods. Next, deal with Russia on terms of cash on the barrelhead. Recognize that the Cold War of the past 15 years will continue for a long time. Realize that our most precious possessions are our technical advantages, which must not be traded away. And our allies should be urged to adopt similar policies. Build up the true economic independence of underdeveloped areas so they need never become dependent upon Russia. Remember that the ultimate objective of our people and the people of the Western world is to provide the fullest possible dignity and freedom of the individual living in a peaceful world. This includes Russians, Chinese, Africans, and all the people of the world. Seek the ultimate objective of freedom for the Russian people and the enslaved people in the communist bloc, and hope for their peace and prosperity. But finally, be realistic and recognize that there is no real chance for this friendly relationship in our lifetime. As we adjourn this conference and go our respective ways to contemplate these suggestions to meet the challenge and frustrations of dealing with the Russians, let us be reminded of the concluding remark of Woodrow Wilson in his victory address at the end of World War I. He said, "The most effective organization arises from the spontaneous cooperation of a free people." Thank you very much for your attention, and let's go back to work. That's it, I guess, Admiral.
Shall we adjourn?
Yes, sir.
I guess it is. We don't have to.
Ken, it was real good seeing you again.
I'd like to get a straight shot with you and Coulter, if you will.
All right, sure. Mr. Coulter is willing.
I'd rather be the first time myself.
Tommy, what's your
I want to get
picture?
one with the Admiral.
What, pardon?
Chatting.
Well, thank you for
Dark
visiting.
background to get your dark clothes.
Good to see you in Washington. It's very nice to be here. I will, yeah.
You want to ride? Sure.
Let's ride it.
Let him get anybody else.
Thank you.
Well, I'm sure sorry that I wasn't able to be here yesterday and the day before. The doctor wouldn't let me come. I was disappointed, but I'm sure glad I got here
We'll have
today.
some in a little while. I think you see me around. Yeah.
No, but I've got a copy. You want a copy?
I think so. Bob, where will the copies of this summary be, you know? There are 2 3 parts.
I appreciated the opportunity.
Here's a copy.
Thank you for it. All I hear, the conference was grand all the way through. Yeah, I think they were. That's some good representatives.
Well, a lot of the...
Where do you want to get to?